The morning at Jefferson Elementary began just like any other. At exactly 8 a.m., the school bell rang, echoing through the hallways as dozens of children shuffled toward their classrooms. Laughter, footsteps, the clatter of lockers, the usual symphony of a new school day. Inside the classrooms, teachers marked their attendance books, students unpacked pencil cases, and whispered jokes floated in the air. Aaliyah entered the classroom with a slight sense of hesitation. She knew she looked different from the other girls in the class. Her hair was free, falling naturally around her shoulders, and her skin seemed to stand out even more against the other students. She tried not to look at the teacher and sat down quickly, eyes fixed on her paper. Miss Carter noticed her immediately. Her eyes narrowed, and her lips twisted into a scowl. Her gaze was cold and sharp, like a blade. She couldn't show weakness, especially not now, not with someone challenging her authority. "Aaliyah," Miss Carter's voice rang out, sharp as a bell. "You came in like this again? This is not a place for free fashion." The girl bit her lip but said nothing. She knew that anything she said would only escalate things, only bring about the constant fights Miss Carter loved to instigate whenever she felt challenged. So she just wrote, trying to ignore every word the teacher spat her way. But Miss Carter wasn't done. She walked between the rows of desks, stopping beside Aaliyah, glaring at her hair with clear disdain. "If you took some pride in your appearance," she continued, "maybe you'd be noticed for more than just your antics, but for what you actually do." Aaliyah felt a tightness in her chest, and despite her efforts, a tear slid down her cheek. Miss Carter saw it and, with a smug look, turned back to the board. This was how it always was, but something was different this time. For the first time in a long while, Aaliyah felt she couldn't remain invisible. She made a decision. By the end of the lesson, Aaliyah had resolved that she wouldn't stay silent any longer. A spark had ignited inside her, one that couldn't be put out. But the students knew the truth, especially the black ones. For them, room 204 wasn't just a classroom, it was a cage. Miss Carter watched them like a hawk. Every move, every whisper, every expression was monitored. Sit up straight, keep your hands folded, speak only when spoken to, smile, but not too much, be quiet, but not too quiet. To her, black children were trouble waiting to happen. If a black girl wore colorful beads in her braids, Miss Carter sneered. If a black boy came with dreadlocks, she sent him to the principal's office. If one student laughed too loud, disruptive. If another didn't speak, antisocial. There was no winning. That's why Aaliyah kept to herself. She knew the rules, be invisible, and maybe she'd be safe. She clung to her books, avoided eye contact, never talked back. But that silence? It infuriated Miss Carter. There was pride in Aaliyah's stillness. There was strength in her quiet. And Miss Carter couldn't stand it. "She looks at me like I owe her something," she once muttered to another teacher in the lounge. "And that hair, what kind of jumble nonsense is that?" Most didn't hear the comment. But Mabel, the black janitor, did. She gripped her mop a little tighter and said nothing, because she knew speaking up would cost her job. Miss Carter wore her racism like a badge beneath her blouse, hidden from parents, polished for the public. But to the black children in her care, it was as visible as the chalk on her board. So when Aaliyah walked into class with her natural curls free and proud, Miss Carter didn't see messiness. She saw defiance, and she was ready to crush it. Room 204, however, was different. It was silent, unnaturally so. The chairs were arranged in perfect rows, and the chalkboard bore the day's lesson in tidy script. Today, verb review and dictation. Miss Carter, the stern, middle-aged white teacher, already sat at her desk like a judge presiding over a courtroom. Her white blouse was crisp, her hair wound tightly in a bun, and her expression, cold, calculated, unforgiving. Students entered quietly, one by one, barely daring to speak. Everyone knew, in Miss Carter's class, there was no room for silliness, especially not for certain students, the ones with darker skin, with braids or curls, with loud laughs or cultural pride. She called it discipline, others called it something else. Aaliyah was the last to walk in. She was always quiet, reserved, a little withdrawn. That morning, her thick curly hair was loose. Her grandmother hadn't had time to braid it before school. Aaliyah had stayed with her for the weekend, and her mother, rushing to work, hadn't noticed or minded. Aaliyah didn't care either. She loved her curls. They made her feel strong, unique, herself. But not everyone appreciated them. Miss Carter's eyes locked onto Aaliyah the moment she stepped inside. She didn't speak, She didn't need to. Her expression twisted, disapproval, frustration, even disgust. She looked at the little girl as if she were an ink stain on a white shirt. "Sit," she said flatly. Aaliyah shrank a little, shuffled to her desk, and kept her head down. The classroom grew even quieter. A few students noticed the teacher's reaction, the tension in her face, but nobody said a word, just like always. Something had shifted, like a hairline crack in ice. Something was coming. Something no one could stop. Miss Carter had been a teacher for over 20 years. She called herself old school, a champion of discipline, control, and proper behavior. White parents adored her. They praised her strictness, claimed their kids were more respectful thanks to her. The administration loved her spotless record, no scandals, high grades, neat classrooms. Let's take a short pause. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and listening to our stories. Have you ever experienced something similar, injustice, humiliation, or prejudice at school or in life? We truly want to hear your stories. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Now, let's continue. Miss Carter stood by the board, watching intently as the students wrote their dictation. She thrived on order, on things going according to plan, on everyone knowing their place. Today was no different, until she walked in. After the lesson, Aaliyah remained seated at her desk. Long after the other students had left, Miss Carter stood by the window, pretending not to notice her. It seemed she knew the situation was about to spiral out of control, but she still tried to keep her composure. But with each step she took, each word spoken against Miss Carter, the situation grew more tense. She knew she couldn't do this alone, and the thoughts of how to hold her ground began to grow like a snowball, bigger and bigger. On the day that everything changed, Aaliyah met Mabel in the hallway. The conservative school was not a place for fighting for rights, but their silence was now their fault. As before, Mabel didn't offer clear suggestions, but her eyes spoke more than words. "You understand you're risking more than just yourself, right?" she said, glancing at Aaliyah once again. "You're already too strong to keep everything inside, but not everyone will understand your move, and you might harm yourself and your loved ones." Aaliyah stayed silent, her eyes fixed on the door. Mabel couldn't know how this would play out, but she understood that the moment would come when Aaliyah would face reality. "I know," Aaliyah replied softly, "but I can't stand by while others suffer. If I stay silent, it'll be a part of the game too, and I can't be part of that." That evening, when Aaliyah returned home, her parents immediately sensed the change. Her mother noticed her quiet and wary demeanor. Her father, on the other hand, tried to ignore the concern, relying on the idea that everything would be resolved at school. But Aaliyah knew the conflict was nearing its climax. The day came when Miss Carter tried once again to humiliate Aaliyah. Her sarcastic smile didn't hide the fact that she knew Aaliyah wouldn't back down. That day, when the class once again witnessed the humiliation, Aaliyah made her decision. She wouldn't just respond, she would stand her ground. The words she spoke shattered the silence, and the whole class went quiet. "I won't tolerate this anymore." Her voice was firm, and her gaze was filled with resolve. This was the moment that sparked the real battle. Miss Carter wasn't prepared for this. Her gaze turned cold, and her words were sharp. "Do you even know who you're talking to? You think anyone's going to support you?" "My support will be the truth," Aaliyah replied, not breaking her stare. She knew that if she had to fight, it would be on her terms. Aaliyah slowly gathered her things. Her mind was a whirlwind, thoughts bouncing from one to another like an untamed river. She knew she couldn't stay silent anymore, but what could she do? She was alone. No support, no hope of help. At that moment, the door suddenly opened, and in walked someone who always stayed in the shadows but whose role was becoming ever more important, Mabel, the janitor. She gave Aaliyah a quick glance but didn't say a word. All Aaliyah saw were her tired eyes, full of exhaustion and despair. Mabel was one of those who had long ago learned to remain silent, not to interfere with others' problems. But today, her gaze was different. "How are you holding up?" Mabel asked quietly once Miss Carter had left for the teacher's lounge. "Everything okay?" Aaliyah nodded, but her gaze was vacant. She could feel how hard it was to even respond. Mabel noticed that. "You know, sooner or later," she began, her voice full of hidden concern, "she's going to try to spark a conflict. You won't win with her, Aaliyah. She'll find something to latch onto." Aaliyah couldn't stay silent anymore. She stood in front of the woman, and a sense of resolve grew within her. "I'm not staying silent anymore," she said, her voice firm. "I won't let her keep doing this to us, the people who can't defend ourselves. She needs to understand that she can't just threaten us." Mabel looked at her carefully, as if trying to understand what Aaliyah had decided, but there was more concern in her eyes than support. You understand this isn't just a game, right? She asked with a heavy sigh. This woman isn't just a teacher. She's part of a system that never wanted you, or anyone else, to stand up. Aaliyah remained silent, but inside, something shifted. She understood that her fight was more than a personal act of defiance. It was something much bigger. Mabel stood silently by as Aaliyah gathered her things. There was something strange in her eyes, a mix of concern and respect. She knew Aaliyah was about to make a move that would change everything, and possibly lead to tragedy. As Aaliyah walked out of the classroom, she paused for a moment at the door and looked back. She knew there would be no going back. The fight had started now. But her soul was still full of doubt. How would this end? What would happen to her, her parents, her friends, if everything spiraled out of control? Meanwhile, in the teacher's lounge, Miss Carter was talking with her colleagues. She was trying to contain her anger, but her words were harsh, filled with venom. This has gone too far, she said. She can't keep acting like this. That kid with the braids yelled at me in class again yesterday. We can't let kids like her dictate terms. The teacher continued speaking, unaware that her colleagues were not as convinced of her righteousness as she was. But in her eyes was not just racism, there was fear. Fear that her authority might be questioned. And most of all, she feared that Aaliyah, this girl with so much inner strength, might escape her control. Miss Carter had no idea that this day would mark the moment that would divide everything. From the very instant Aaliyah took a step toward resolution, she began a movement that would affect not only her life but the lives of everyone who had ever been under the pressure of a system that wouldn't allow them to be themselves. Meanwhile, in the hallway, Aaliyah felt her heart race faster. She knew she had made her choice, but what would happen next? Days passed, and the tension in the classroom became palpable. Aaliyah couldn't forget the moment when she had firmly told Mabel that she wouldn't stay silent anymore. Each day, she felt more and more as though her inner world was shifting. She was no longer the quiet girl who feared speaking up. She was starting to realize that her silence was not just a personal choice but an act of survival in a world where silence was perceived as weakness. Her sarcastic smile didn't hide the fact that she knew Aaliyah wouldn't back down. That day, when the class once again witnessed the humiliation, Aaliyah made her decision. She wouldn't just respond. She would stand her ground. The words she spoke shattered the silence, and the whole class went quiet. I won't tolerate this anymore. Her voice was firm, and her gaze was filled with resolve. This was the moment that sparked the real battle. Miss Carter wasn't prepared for this. Her gaze turned cold, and her words were sharp. Do you even know who you're talking to? You think anyone's going to support you? My support will be the truth, Aaliyah replied, not breaking her stare. She knew that if she had to fight, it would be on her terms. The day after Aaliyah stood up to Miss Carter, the atmosphere in the school shifted dramatically. Eyes were on her at every turn. Some looked with admiration, some with judgment, and others with concern. But none of those looks could change what she had done. With each step she took, Aaliyah felt like her world was breaking apart, transforming into a battlefield where she had to fight for her honor, her dignity, and for those who couldn't do it themselves. The classroom was eerily quiet. Everyone sat with their heads down, trying not to draw attention. Even Miss Carter, who was always ready to reprimand and humiliate, didn't say a word. But Aaliyah could feel how her actions were beginning to change the dynamics of the school. She hadn't just clashed with one teacher. She had stood up against everything that the school, perhaps, represented. And it was her determination that made her stronger than ever. During break, Aaliyah walked up to the window and looked outside. She noticed a few students whispering among themselves, throwing glances in her direction. She felt like something significant had shifted in that moment when she hadn't backed down. The world was no longer the way it had been. But the question remained, where would this lead? When she turned back to the classroom, her gaze met Mabel's, who was standing by the door, quietly watching what was happening. Mabel approached and placed a hand on Aaliyah's shoulder. She didn't say a word, but her silence spoke louder than anything. There was pride in her eyes, but also worry. You realize what's happened, right? Mabel finally asked, not hiding the concern in her voice. Aaliyah nodded. I can't go back, she replied. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. Mabel looked at her with a heavy sigh. You think it's that simple? How many people will suffer if you keep going? We are the minority in this world, and if you don't stay careful now, it could be the end of you. Aaliyah felt her heart tighten with fear, but she couldn't stop. This was too important. Even if she had to lose everything, she had to keep moving forward. Meanwhile, in the teacher's lounge, Miss Carter and her colleagues were discussing what had happened. Grim faces and hushed whispers filled the room. Some tried to justify her actions, others doubted, but in the end, they all came to a single conclusion: Aaliyah needed to be punished. "We can't let this continue," Miss Carter said. Suppressing her anger, she challenged us. She stood in our way. She stood up, her eyes blazing with fury, and her entire demeanor radiated hatred toward those who dared defy her authority. "We need to do something about this. She can't just walk away with a win. This is a challenge to everything we stand for." Her words didn't bode well for Aaliyah, but she had no idea how this would all play out for her. Everything was building toward a climax, and neither side was willing to back down. The school seemed to transform into an arena where every step, every word she said, became a subject of discussion. The teachers continued to whisper, and her classmates held their breath, afraid to openly support her or condemn her. Outside, the threat was already palpable. Miss Carter was clearly preparing for a final, decisive step that could tip the scales. Meanwhile, Aaliyah found herself questioning whether she should continue down this path. She couldn't stop because she knew that if she backed down now, it wouldn't just be a loss for her, but for everyone who had ever faced injustice. But the fear didn't leave her. At night, when she closed her eyes, the scenes of that fateful day when she accused Carter of racism kept replaying in her mind. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something much more dangerous awaited her. Mabel, who had been by her side through it all, sensed that her friend was beginning to lose confidence. She decided that it was time to have an honest conversation. "You shouldn't have to do this alone," Mabel said when they met again on the schoolyard. "You know I'll always be with you, right?" Aaliyah looked at her, and for a moment, she felt her chest tighten with all the emotion she had been holding back. "I understand that you want to support me," she said quietly, "but it's not that simple. I'm not just fighting Carter. I'm fighting the system, fighting what's deeply embedded in this society. I can't stand still. I have to keep moving forward, no matter what." Mabel didn't know how to respond. She felt that her words were an empty promise because she wasn't sure what would happen next either. 2 days later, Aaliyah received a letter from her mother. The letter said that her mom was coming to the school to address the situation. Aaliyah felt her heart race. This was an unexpected move. 2 days later, Aaliyah received a letter from her mother. The letter said that her mom was coming to the school to address the situation. Aaliyah felt her heart race. This was an unexpected move. Her mother had always avoided such situations, but now everything was changing. Her mom was coming, and Aaliyah knew this could mark the beginning of a new chapter. When the day of the visit arrived, the school was on edge. Everyone knew something significant was about to happen. Teachers held their breath, and students watched eagerly to see what Aaliyah's mother would say. When she arrived, all eyes immediately turned toward her. The woman, tall and slender, with a serious expression, entered the principal's office. Her presence was unusual. She didn't look like the other parents who came to school. Her confident step and calm, but assured gaze commanded respect. The principal, a man in his mid-40s, sat at his desk with a tense expression. He knew a serious conversation was coming. He invited her to sit, but Aaliyah's mother, without saying a word, went straight to the point. "I'm here to talk about what happened with my daughter," she said, not hiding her resolve. "I'm not here for any excuses. I came for the truth." The principal flinched slightly but tried to remain calm. He began explaining his position, but Aaliyah felt her tension growing. This was the moment of truth, the moment that could change her life forever. Aaliyah's mother sat across from the principal, her face hard and focused, her gaze unwavering, not once acknowledging the curious glances that occasionally slipped through the door. Aaliyah sat next to her, unsure of what she was feeling: fear, anxiety, or maybe hope. Her mother had come to support her, but it felt like that support didn't lift the heavy weight that rested on her shoulders. The principal, still nervous, tried to speak calmly, but it was clear that he was struggling to keep his composure. He attempted to justify his actions, citing school rules and policies, but his words came across as hollow and unconvincing. "I understand your concerns," he said, "but we acted within the scope of our program to improve discipline. We couldn't allow this situation to go unchecked." But Aaliyah's mother, not willing to listen to any more excuses, interrupted him. "My daughter came here to learn, not to be the subject of your experiments. The racism you're showing is not discipline. You took it upon yourselves to judge her based on her appearance, and that will not be forgiven. I will fight for her to the end if you continue down this path." Her words carried such force that even the principal didn't know how to respond. Aaliyah felt her pride for her mother grow. She stood by her, knowing that her mother was ready to fight for her. This was more than just support, it was real protection. something she had longed for. Aaliyah's mother pulled out her phone and called her lawyer. Her voice held no fear, only determination. "I've already started the process. Your actions will not go unchallenged," she said. "My daughter will remain at this school, and I'll do whatever it takes to ensure she receives fair treatment." Aaliyah felt her heart race. Her mother was taking on a battle she might not have been able to fight on her own, but now she was part of it. This was important, not just for her, but for anyone who had ever felt humiliated because of their race or skin color. Now they were a united front. The principal tried a few more times to argue, but all of his attempts were futile. Aaliyah's mother continued to insist that the situation would be resolved in court. Everything that had happened only strengthened her resolve, and Aaliyah began to realize just how pivotal this moment was in her life. It wasn't just a turning point, it was the decisive moment. When the meeting ended, they left the principal's office. Aaliyah, exhausted but empowered, walked beside her mother, feeling the weight lift with each step. "We're going to win," her mother said with unwavering confidence as they stepped outside. Aaliyah nodded. There was still more to come, but now she felt she had the strength to continue. Mother and daughter walked across the school courtyard, and the silence that surrounded them felt strange. The usual noise of students during recess was absent, maybe because everyone already knew what had happened. Aaliyah felt the world around her shifting. Her mind raced with thoughts of how her school life had suddenly changed. Everything was different now, from the way her classmates looked at her to the comments online. What had once felt normal was now part of her personal battle. Her mother walked beside her, confident, but Aaliyah noticed that her face was tense. Maybe she didn't want to show her daughter how deeply the incident was affecting her, but Aaliyah knew better. Her mother, always so strong, now seemed exhausted, and although her determination didn't waver, Aaliyah could feel that this fight would cost them both. They reached the car, and as they sat down, her mother turned off her phone, which had been ringing nonstop. Replies to messages, calls, documents, legal questions, all of it was now part of the road ahead. Aaliyah placed her hands on her lap, feeling the cold metal of the steering wheel echoing her unease. She couldn't understand what awaited her next. "We're on this path now," her mother said, her hands on the wheel, pausing for a moment. "But you need to understand that the fight will be long, and if anyone tries to hurt you again, I'll be here to protect you. We're not alone in this." Aaliyah nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She felt like everything inside her was turning over. The fear of what the future held mingled with pride for her mother. She knew she couldn't go through all of this alone, and now she had an ally who would do anything to protect her. She wondered what her life would look like after this. Even if her mother won the case and her rights were restored, what about her relationships with her classmates, with the teachers, with those who couldn't forget how she had been publicly humiliated? Her mother didn't like discussing such things. She preferred to talk about solutions, about what they needed to do next, not about what might have happened if things had gone differently. But Aaliyah couldn't help but think about it. "We'll make it," her mother said, bringing her back to the present. "And you need to remember one thing, this isn't your fault." Those simple words became important to Aaliyah. She felt the heavy burden lighten a little. It wasn't her fault, she was simply part of a system that had, at some point, failed. Now, their path was about finding a way to win. "I love you," her mother said, starting the car. "Now let's move forward, not backward." Aaliyah gave a faint smile and looked out the window. The fear in her heart was still there, but it was the fear of the unknown, not of the fact that they might not succeed. The day of the trial had arrived. Everything was prepared, the lawyers, documents, testimonies, all the details. Aaliyah sat in the courtroom, next to her mother, feeling the tension rise with every passing moment. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and her thoughts moved from one worry to the next. This wasn't just about her, it was about justice for everyone who had ever found themselves in a similar situation. But at that moment, Aaliyah was mostly thinking about how this fight would change her life and her perception of the world. Her mother sat next to her, her face calm, but her eyes showed that she, too, was deeply affected. Her gaze was focused, full of determination. She knew this was going to be a difficult path, but she wasn't about to back down. Every word spoken in the courtroom mattered. Every detail was important. The judge entered the room, and everyone stood. When he sat down, the proceedings began, and Aaliyah's mother's lawyers started presenting their arguments. He spoke about the right to respect, the inadmissibility of discrimination, and how the teacher had violated not only the law but the moral standards of society. Each of his points was precise, clear, and undeniably backed by evidence. But when it was the teacher's defense attorney's turn, Aaliyah felt her heart freeze. The teacher's lawyer tried to present her actions as a simple mistake. a result of fatigue and overwork. He described the teacher's actions as nothing more than punishment for a bad hairstyle, trying to downplay the situation. But Aaliyah knew this wasn't just a mistake, it was cruel humiliation, part of a system that continued to oppress people like her. Before making conclusions, let's take a look at the student's behavior, the lawyer said, presenting the next piece of evidence, photographs taken when Aaliyah was in class, showing her hair. Aaliyah felt all eyes on her. She clenched her fists, trying not to let her emotions show. These photographs said nothing about what had really happened, but they placed her in a vulnerable position once again. She couldn't stay silent any longer. Suddenly, her mother stood up. All eyes were on her now. "May I make a comment?" she said, her voice firm and resolute. "My daughter is not to blame for what happened. If anyone should be held accountable, it is those who allowed this situation to unfold." Her mother's words were like thunder in a clear sky. Everyone froze. The judge looked at her, his expression serious. He knew this case wasn't going to be as simple as he had thought. Aaliyah looked around the room. People were watching her, watching her mother. They were all now part of this conflict. But if she and her mother were to win, they had to prove that the truth was on their side. "We won't stop," her mother said, addressing the judge, "until everyone knows the truth." The moment when all questions had been asked and only the verdict remained was a moment of realization for Aaliyah. Her life was about to change. This case wasn't just about personal grievances. It had become a symbol for many others who had also faced humiliation and injustice. But the road ahead would be long and difficult. She and her mother knew that many obstacles lay ahead. But in that moment, their determination was unwavering. They weren't going to stop. The trial dragged on for several days, and with each new day, more anxiety and questions arose. Aaliyah could no longer shake the feeling that she was at the center of something much bigger than just personal revenge or defending her rights. This was a symbol for everyone who had ever faced inequality, for everyone who had felt oppressed by the system, unfairly punished because of their race, origin, or appearance. And while Aaliyah felt like this trial had become her life, she couldn't help but think about what kind of mark it would leave on her future. On the next day, Aaliyah's mother made a firm statement in court, explaining that the teacher's actions had deeper roots than just an unfortunate mistake. She described how there had been a pattern of hidden discrimination in their school, how some teachers allowed themselves to make judgments based on biased stereotypes. She spoke not just about one individual's actions, but about a system that created the conditions for racism to manifest. The court was absorbed in her speech. It was not just a statement, it was a cry from the heart that needed to be heard. The teacher, on the other hand, continued to claim she didn't see anything offensive in her actions. Her lawyer tried to argue that the teacher was acting within the boundaries of discipline and was trying to shape the student for her own future benefit. These excuses only irritated those present in the courtroom even more. Aaliyah felt her gaze narrow as she looked at the woman who had ruined her life, yet she was still attempting to justify her actions. But the defining moment came when the judge made his decision. He announced that the verdict would be delivered in 2 days, and for now, both sides were asked to prepare their final arguments. Aaliyah wasn't sure what to feel. On one hand, she felt a sense of relief that the pressure was off her, that the trial was nearing its end. But on the other hand, her anxiety grew. After all, each new day could bring unexpected turns. When the trial was adjourned, mother and daughter headed home. The silence in the car was deafening. Neither of them could speak about what had happened. Their hearts were filled with mixed emotions, pain over what had occurred, anger over the injustice, and at the same time, a hope that this trial could change a lot. But that evening, Aaliyah realized that no matter what the outcome was, she would never be the same again. This battle had turned her view of the world upside down, her perception of the people around her, and the system she lived in. "Mom, I can't stop," Aaliyah said, breaking the silence at last. "If we win, I'll fight for others. This can't happen again." Her mother looked at her with an expression that spoke more than words ever could. "You're not alone," she replied softly, but firmly. "We're in this together." 2 days had passed, and finally, the day had arrived, the day the court was to render its verdict. Aaliyah felt her heart pounding in her chest. Her mother tried to remain calm, but even her experience couldn't prepare them for what was about to unfold. The courtroom was packed: journalists, activists, representatives from human rights organizations, friends, and acquaintances, and, of course, Miss Margaret, the teacher, who was now at the center of it all. She sat in her chair with her head held high, but her eyes betrayed a certain uncertainty. Hidden behind a mask of composure, she knew everything depended on the judge's decision. Aaliyah sat next to her mother, almost holding her breath. She could feel all eyes on her, as though her life depended on what the judge would say. But at one point, when the room became quieter than ever, and the tension in the air became almost tangible, Aaliyah realized something important. No matter what happened, she had already won. She had fought. She had made people see the truth, and that was her personal victory. The judge stood up. He slowly approached the bench and spoke, his voice even but heavy with weight. He explained that despite the defendant's statements and justifications, her actions had been nothing short of a violation of human rights. He declared that Ms. Margaret's actions were discriminatory, and she would face consequences. A teacher must be a role model, the judge said. In this case, the defendant's actions not only violated the rights of the student but also highlighted the helplessness of a system that allowed such actions. The courtroom erupted into applause and cheers, but for Aaliyah, it wasn't just a reward, it was the realization that her fight had borne fruit. Miss Margaret looked stunned. She tried to say something, but words failed her, and her gaze was empty. The judge continued, imposing a fine and indefinite suspension from her teaching position. This was not all, as the school itself would have to reevaluate its policies and conduct a training session on inclusivity and non-discrimination for all the staff. As the trial ended, Aaliyah and her mother stepped outside, where reporters were waiting. Questions rained down from all sides, but Aaliyah was ready to answer. She knew her voice was no longer just heard within her family or among her friends. It was now much wider. "We won," she said loudly to the crowd, "but the real victory is when something like this never happens again." Her words were heard. This was more than just a court case. It was the beginning of change. When Aaliyah and her mother got into the car, they knew they had not only won the case but also become part of something much more significant that would touch the lives of many. The court case had long since ended, but Aaliyah still couldn't get used to the thought that her life had changed. She looked back at everything that had happened and thought about how far she had come. What had started as a terrible and unjust situation had turned into her personal fight for justice, for her voice to be heard. But by this moment, she realized that her victory wasn't just about winning the case. It was much more. It was a step toward change. She and her mother had returned home. The whole drive from the courthouse to their apartment was filled with silence. Sometimes, Aaliyah just wanted the day to end so they could finally feel relief. But in her chest, another feeling was growing. It was the feeling of victory. With every passing minute, she realized that the situation with the teacher was just a small part of a bigger issue that affected all of us. It was a signal to everyone, it's possible and necessary to fight against injustice. The next day, when the news of Aaliyah and her mother's victory spread, many people came to their home to congratulate them. The media didn't stop asking questions, seeking more details, more emotions. But Aaliyah began to understand. She didn't need to explain her position anymore. She was no longer just the girl who had faced the system. She had become a symbol of how one person can impact much, if they are determined enough. Her mother, who had always been her support, now smiled at her daughter, proud of her courage and resilience. They both knew that this victory was just the beginning. In Aaliyah's eyes, there were sparks of determination, and she knew exactly what her next goal was, to help everyone who found themselves in a similar situation. "We can do more," she said as they sat down for dinner in their small apartment. "Maybe this is our chance for change. We can fight for others." A few weeks later, the school where Ms. Margaret worked began to take its first steps toward change. The entire educational system reviewed its approach to inclusivity, and training for teachers was implemented. But for Aaliyah, it wasn't just about what was happening in the school. She understood that true success is when people start seeing each other as equals, regardless of skin color or background. That had become her personal mission, to change the world for the better. Aaliyah continued her fight, but now with a different perspective. She became an activist, participating in various organizations, supporting projects aimed at combating racism. Her speeches and story inspired many, and she knew her experience could help not only her but others as well. She became an example for many, and her story was known and spoken about in many countries. When she stood on stage, speaking in front of a large audience, she realized that her life had taken on new meaning. This was more than just a victory in court. It was the formation of her identity as a person who was ready to fight for what she believed in. Aaliyah was ready to continue this fight because she knew, as long as these problems existed, the fight for justice had to go on.